politics and above religion, a moral authority exists known globally as the Ageless Wisdom. It is the study of consciousness, the mystery of awareness, which cannot be measured, yet will not be denied. Stay tuned as we explore consciousness, the fundamental nature of reality. Welcome to the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School with Michael Benner.
Hello, friends. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School on 90.7 FM, KPFK in Los Angeles, streaming for the world at kpfk.org. Thanks so much for being with us today. This is a special program today, since every week we are about some aspect of the study of consciousness and learning to raise consciousness or to expand awareness and to look at all the qualities of consciousness that often are not attributed to the nature of what it means to be sentient or aware or alert, such as a set of exalted values and ethics, morality that is inherent in higher consciousness. Also, the nature of attention, mindfulness, intention, volition, learning to substitute even tempered, well-reasoned responses for knee-jerk reactions. How about that? Not to mention recognizing our emotions as responses, not something that someone did to you, and taking ownership of that emotional response such that you can learn about yourself instead of obsess on the stimulus, whoever or whatever caused you to feel the way you do. These are just some of the things that we talk about when we discuss the nature of consciousness. But this week we have a very special guest. He is the chairman of the Department of Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Now, I'll bet you didn't even know there was such a thing as departments of consciousness study at various universities. It's a fairly new phenomenon, as is the conference that's coming up next week and that we're going to talk about today. This one in Tucson, it's a biannual conference called the Science of Consciousness. It's held in even-numbered years, so that's this year, in Tucson at a Lowe's resort near the University of Arizona campus. And again, it's all next week, the 18th through the 22nd of April. You can attend this conference either in person or, more likely, online. So it's a hybrid conference, in person in this resort outside Tucson or online. And the speakers throughout the week and the panels and the debates, and there's even some slam poetry and a lecture by a ayahuasca shaman, as well as anesthesiologists who are studying where consciousness goes when we're anesthetized. And it's just this wide-ranging overview of the nature of consciousness from quantum physics to metaphysics, from mysticism to empirical science. And the chairman of the department and the director of the conference, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, is our guest today. So we're going to bring him on. And I want to give him as much time as possible. So we're going to do a quick break right up front, and then we'll go into two longer segments that'll take us right through the hour to 2 o'clock. All right? So stay tuned. The Science of Consciousness. We'll be talking about what is it, where does it come from? Are plants conscious? Is the mineral kingdom conscious? And if we're studying consciousness in the context of anesthetics, what about psychedelics? Yep, we'll be talking about that too with Dr. Hameroff. So stay with us. This is the Ageless Wisdom on 90.7 FM, KPFK in Los Angeles.
Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. I host a radio show called The Laura Flanders Show, where, as we say, the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. At KPFK, we believe in free speech, independent thought, and universal equality, but it isn't free. We bring you information without corporate influence, political spin, or government funding. We give a voice to the voiceless, or at least those whose voices are never heard on other stations. The Laura Flanders Show is all about people making change and connecting with each other. Keep community connected radio alive by making a tax-deductible contribution today at kpfk.org.
It's the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School on your radio at 90.7 FM for all of Southern California, from Santa Barbara to San Diego, from the sea to the desert. And, of course, we stream for the world at kpfk.org. This program is also podcast and even posted to YouTube, but we're always pleased when you can join us live Tuesday afternoons at 1 o'clock. As our intro says, this is a program about consciousness. That's, of course, a huge field and somewhat difficult to describe. We could call it self-awareness, about understanding, but there's so much more to consciousness. There's intention and attention, and I think even some inherent ethics and values that go along with being ever more aware, ever more awake. And there's a conference coming up in Tucson, Arizona, called the Science of Consciousness that I want you to know about. Because whether you're able to attend in person or online, this is a very important conference, the Science of Consciousness. It happens every other year at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Beautiful city, as I'm sure you know. And we're fortunate to have I'm not sure I have the title, the director or the chairman of the conference, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, with us today on KPFK. And Dr. Stuart, good afternoon and welcome to the radio.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to see you.
Your interest in consciousness led you to become a medical doctor and an anesthesiologist. Is that right?
Yes. In undergraduate school, I took a little philosophy of mind as well as mostly sciences and got interested in consciousness. And in medical school, I gravitated towards, neuroscience, psychiatry, neurology, neurosurgery, but none of those really grabbed me. And I spent a research elective in a lab in medical school studying cell division and got interested in these structures called microtubules, which process information to organize the cell division, pull apart the chromosomes perfectly. And while everybody else in the lab got interested in the chromosomes and genetics, I got interested in how these structures seem to know where to go and what to do and how to organize things so perfectly. And their structure had become known at that time, and they looked like lattices, kind of like computers, which were new to me. And I got the idea that they might have something to do with processing information relevant to consciousness in neurons. And so I just kind of got that idea that I could never get rid of. And I subsequently went into anesthesia to try to figure out how anesthesia works to erase consciousness.
So these microtubulars exist only in neurons, brain cells?
They exist in all cells, actually, all animal cells in various forms, but in neurons are in unique arrangements and very prevalent. In all other cells, they're kind of like spokes of a wheel or radiating in all in the same direction. But in neurons, in the dendrites and cell bodies, they're broken, interrupted, and mixed polarities. So one, they have a plus and a minus end, and they're arranged so that the plus ends are next to the minus ends of their neighbors for some kind of strange reason that nobody's ever figured out, although we think it's to encourage and cause resonance and interference as kind of a hologram to project consciousness. But the point is that I think, and my colleagues and I think, that consciousness is coming from a deeper level in these microtubules inside neurons.
The consciousness springs, well, this is the big question, of course, this is the debate. Is consciousness an epiphenomena of brain chemistry, or does it pre-exist, and does it come through the mind or through the brain? So Where do you come down on that?
Well, it's a key question. Which came first, consciousness or life, even in the course of the universe? And most neuroscientists and philosophers would say that life happened, life evolved, and at some critical point of complexity, for example, in a brain, consciousness emerged and then kind of took over, or I think it took over, our control of things. But if you're a panpsychist or a spiritualist or believe in objective reduction as the cause of consciousness, then it was there first. And I think actually that consciousness, or even very simple proto-consciousness, that could give rise to pleasure, for example, was the spark of life and actually prompted its origin back in the primordial soup or wherever consciousness first arose. And that these simple organic molecules started having little conscious moments, according to a theory put forth by Roger Penrose. Right? He put forth a theory of why they would be conscious. And I suggested they could happen in the primordial soup. And it was primitive pleasure that drove these molecules to self-organize and eventually evolve. I mean, it doesn't make sense that life started from simple molecules with no genes, and went millions of years to get to simple organisms, and then on from there without any motivation, without any reason. Dawkins says it's to promote survival of the gene, but the gene doesn't feel, as far as we can know. But I think feelings were there right from the beginning and prompted the origin of life, and it sparked its evolution. I mean, if you go to any laboratory looking at animal behavior or even human behavior, it's all driven in some way by pleasure or reward or avoidance of displeasure, not necessarily just hedonism, but also altruism and spiritual pleasure and that sort of thing. So I think consciousness was there first and actually promoted or prompted the origin of life way back when.
Well, it's wonderful to hear an empirical scientist suggest such a thing. So thank you for that. But it doesn't mean it's a settled issue. This is just all still so wonderfully fascinating. And I've already confessed to you before we began the interview, my fascination, my obsession with attempting to understand consciousness. And it seems the more insight I gain, the less I really know about it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the phenomena that I've read about. And actually, I saw a video of, let's see, what was it? It was some kind of slime mold that was in an experiment solving the shortest path to food problem in some microscopic maze, suggesting that this slime mold had awareness, that it could learn, it could recall, it could understand on some extremely simple level where is the food and what's the easiest way to get there. Now, that's a single-cell life form. Are amoeba and paramecium, are these tiny little critters aware of themselves?
I think they may be. But the key question is whether they have feelings at all, whether they're self-aware or just aware or have some notion of something tastes good to eat or something is dangerous, run away. Both those instances, the slime mold, which is a giant amoeba, kind of oozes in all different directions. And it oozes because its microtubules, which we mentioned before, will point in a particular direction, and then the actin flows toward it and it engulfs whatever it wants to eat or engulf. And a paramecium is a little bit different. It has these, it's also driven by microtubules, which stick out in things called cilia, which act as both sensors and oars and swim around quite nimbly to find food, to avoid obstacles, find a mate, to have sex. This paramecium, actually, two paramecium fuse during sex and are quite still. And they have very clever behavior. They don't like being threatened, and they like food, and they like sex, and they can learn. If you suck them into a capillary tube, they get out faster and faster each time. Now, this is a problem for most theorists because most theorists, as I mentioned before, would say that consciousness and even cognition, even learning that need not be conscious happens by the brain or a system acting like a computer, a complex computer of simple neurons, that the neurons are simply 1 or 0, like in a computer, or bit states, on or off. And if you put enough of these in the right arrangement, you get computation, you get clever behavior, and eventually you get consciousness. Well, that would require a whole bunch of amoeba hooked up in a big network, or a whole bunch of paramecium. And yet there's only one. They're not part of a network. And they accomplish their cognition and consciousness, if they have it, through their microtubules, which are the same structures. And by the way, I would say that I think they probably are, but consciousness is kind of like a spectrum, kind of like photons. There's high frequency and low frequency, and depending on the development of the organism, people like us with a lot of microtubules, for example, are having, say, 10 million conscious moments per second of high complexity and high intensity, whereas a paramecium or an amoeba might be just having 2 or 3 per minute, something very slow. Or even a plant might have 1 or 2 per minute. To them, it's real, it's a feeling, but it's not as content-laden, and it's not as intense. And there's kind of gaps in between. So I think all creatures may have some degree of consciousness, all creatures with microtubules, which is pretty much all creatures, but just at a much slower, less intense, less experiential nature. But that would explain their behavior, why simple organisms go for food or plants follow the sun. It's to enrich, get more energy, but also because some way it feels good, I think. And I think feelings and proto-conscious feelings are at the heart of all this.
Wow. Why does a plant follow this? I mean, we could answer it on one level. It wants to survive, but why does a plant reach for the sun and follow it across the sky and pose up at night?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, there's a workshop at our conference by Bruce McIver from Stanford and Rajneesh Khanna, who's in a private firm in the Bay Area dealing with plants, and they're studying plants. And Bruce is an anesthetic mechanism researcher, and they're exactly looking at that kind of stuff of the mechanism of phototropism, where the sunflower follows the sun, or the Venus flytrap grabs the fly. And believe it or not, they're finding, or at least there's testing the question whether it's the microtubules that are mediating this behavior, including following the sun and other behaviors. So they're trying to you can anesthetize these plants in general, so they don't follow the sun, they don't respond to the fly, and so they're trying to figure out if that's mediated by microtubules, which are becoming a valid candidate for the mechanism of anesthesia in our brains as well as animals and plants.
Back in the late 60s or early 1970s, there was a book by a fellow named Cleve Baxter called The Secret Life of Plants.
Yeah, I read it.
He was a polygraph expert. I think that's how he got into measuring the responses of these plants. But what was your take on that? The idea that a plant is potentially aware of the attitudes of its keeper, that if we're nice to our plants and love them like they're puppy dogs or kittens, they'll do better than if we are apathetic or mean to them.
Well, my wife takes wonderful care of our plants because she feels that way. But I have to say that it doesn't necessarily mean they're conscious. You can have behavior without consciousness. And not to throw a wet blanket on all this, but Chalmers has raised a question of zombies, philosophical zombies, that people who look and act like they're conscious, like you and me, could actually be cleverly programmed to talk about consciousness without actually having it. And we would be what philosophers call zombies. And the question is whether zombies are actually possible. Is it possible to have essentially an identical brain and be conscious or not conscious? And I think the difference is most scientists and philosophers look only at the surface of the neuron without going to a deeper level into the microtubules, where you get into the interesting quantum effects, which tie things together and entangle you and connect the universe. So I think consciousness is very basic.
Oh, indeed. Let's go back to the paramecium. I think most of us remember from high school, these were the little creatures that were entertaining us in the microscope, and we remember the cilia. They remind me of a centipede or a millipede, and you're saying it's in these little legs, these little hair fibers.
Which we have throughout our body, in our lungs, in our GI tract, and in all cells, because the same structures make up what are called centrioles, which control the cell division. And one of these centrioles is the same structure as the cilia, and in neurons actually protrudes through the its membrane cover, but it sticks out of the cell body like an antenna, which may be detecting photons. There's a lot of information now that there's photons, light in the brain, and whether it's metabolic byproducts of chemical reactions, which a lot of people say, or whether it's actually being used for communication, like some kind of quantum optical device. And we've been doing experiments that suggest that there are quantum optical effects in microtubules that are inhibited by anesthesia. And we think that might be a candidate for how anesthesia works.
I'm anxious to talk to you about anesthesia too, but here's where I'm headed. If the slime mold is conscious of itself in some way, on some level, or to some degree, does that mean that neurons and perhaps other cells, skin cells, bone cells, blood cells, T cells, also have some degree of awareness of themselves existing?
I think that, the gut microbiome too, my wife always reminds me. But I think in the brain, so go back to consciousness is a collapse of the wave function that involves a certain amount of mass and superposition. I'm kind of jumping ahead here. So yes, you could have localized bits of consciousness in all these cells, or even in the table, or even in the air molecules, but they would be random and proto-conscious. They wouldn't have any memory. They wouldn't have any context. They wouldn't have any meaning, I would say. So only in the brain, or more in the brain than anywhere else, are the microtubules and the quantum states organized, entangled, and orchestrated, so they're communicating with each other. So we have a complex scene rather than little its and bits of unconnected qualia and feelings, which is, I think, what it would be like to be something like a piece of wood, or neuroscientists resort to panpsychism because they can't explain consciousness. But when you get to there's some consciousness with every atom, with every molecule. The problem with that is that they don't connect; they're not interconnected. So you have little disconnected moments here, there, and everywhere, which don't amount to anything. But in a quantum system, they entangle, they become one and unified, so that I get a unified, coherent image of you that I'm looking at my computer screen right now, and you of me, and everything is integrated, or better yet, orchestrated into a unified conscious experience, rather than like in the cells you mentioned, they all might have their own little bits of awareness that don't amount to anything because they don't talk to each other.
So that sort of answers my next question. Does, collectively speaking, the cells that comprise our heart, are they aware of themselves as a heart as opposed to the lung or the kidneys? The heart beats itself. It doesn't rely on a signal from the brain. There's as you know, there's a node in the heart that tells it to beat.
Yeah. The SA node and the AV node, and there is quite a collection of neurons in the heart, actually. And I remember I used to do cardiac anesthesia. I don't do it any longer, but we did a lot of heart transplants back in the day, and we still do, but I'm not involved in. And there was the cardiac surgeons were looking at this is all very hush hush, but memory from a donor transmitted to a receiver of a heart, and the family of the receiver of the heart transplant would say, well, he or she is doing such and such that he or she never did before, and is it possible that the donor loved to dance or loved to do this or that or the other? And they did find some very interesting things, and it could be that memory is, we don't know where memory is stored still. People say it's in the synapses, but those proteins last hours to days, and yet memories last lifetimes. So I think it's likely that the memories are in the microtubules, which are also in those neurons in the heart. So it's possible that some memories are transferred like that. But that's kind of a touchy subject for a lot of reasons.
Let's go back to your wife's comment about the gut. There are neurons in the gut, are there not?
Yes, there are, and there's also all these bacteria that may communicate with them. There are neurons in the gut, and they may be detecting what these organisms are saying. And it's also possible to treat the gut problems with the gut, irritable bowel and stuff like that. We're looking at with treating with vagal ultrasound, applying ultrasound to the vagus nerve, which innervates the whole gut, and there are microtubules in all these neurons. But that's kind of a therapeutic spin-off of that. But there's nerves everywhere. But if they're not entangled into one, they wouldn't necessarily be part of one unified consciousness. They could be doing their own little thing, as could inanimate objects, for that matter.
So they're not telepathic, is what you're saying.
Well, they could be if they're entangled, but they'd have to, I think neurons in our own brain from one part to the other are telepathic. They have to communicate much faster than you could by neural transmission, by sending a membrane potential down the axon or dendritic potentials. I think you need entanglement and coherence just for normal function. You mentioned, for example, epiphenomenal before, the idea that our actions we're not really in conscious control. The consciousness is along for the ride, and we are, as Huxley said, merely helpless spectators. That's because if you say something, and I see something, and the signal goes from my eyes to the thalamus to the back of my brain to B1, where it's not conscious. Then it goes forward to the front of the brain, where it picks up shape, color, motion, meaning, and then to the front of the brain, it's broadcast throughout the brain. It's that third wave of broadcast that correlates with consciousness. And yet that doesn't happen until 300 to 500 milliseconds after the impulse hits my eyes. And yet I will respond, or everybody, not just me, responds within 100 milliseconds before that activity occurs as far as we can measure it. And yet we've already responded. So therefore, the assumption in neuroscience and philosophy is that we act non-consciously, our autopilot, our inner zombie, if you will, responds. And then a little later, our consciousness happens, and we think we were in control when we really weren't. Now, unfortunately, that's the party line in neuroscience and philosophy, because when we do measure this activity, it seems to happen too late. However, there's a way around that, and there's actually evidence going back to the 70s from Ben Libet's famous work about backward time referral in the brain. And Roger Penrose and others, including Yakir Aharonov and others, have shown that you can have backward time referral with quantum collapse. So if there's a quantum mechanism in the brain, you can have this funny backward time referral, which means that we actually could be in conscious control in real time, even though that electrical activity lags behind. And this is a hot topic of debate and stuff we talked about at our conference. In fact, we're going to have a session about that. And Daniel Sheehan and Roger Penrose and Paul Davies will be in that session. And one of the topics will be whether this backward time effect can actually occur in the brain, and if so, give us conscious control in real time rather than us being merely epiphenomenal.
I need to take a short break, Stuart, and then when we come back, I want to talk about anesthesia and where does consciousness go. Most of us, I think, have probably had some experience with general anesthesia. And, of course, I also want to emphasize that the timing of you being on my show here today has to do with a conference coming up real soon, a couple of weeks here in April in Tucson. We wanted to talk about that a little, too. My guest is Dr. Stuart Hameroff, and we're talking about consciousness. And wow, what a fascinating topic. And stay exactly where you are. We'll be back after this short break. This is the Mystery School in KPFK.
Hi, this is Lisa Garr, inviting you to join me every Wednesday and Thursday at 1 o'clock for The Aware Show as we continue to bring you cutting-edge interviews about health, spirituality, and self-awareness. That's every Wednesday and Thursday, 1 o'clock on The Aware Show.
KPFK on your radio. This is the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School, heard here at 90.7 FM. Every Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock. We're talking about consciousness. We're talking about awareness. My guest is Dr. Stuart Hameroff from the University of Arizona in Tucson. And he's with us as the chairman or director of a conference that's coming up in Tucson that is held every other year. Well, you were saying, Stuart, every other year in Tucson, and then and the odd number years it floats around the world. Tell us a little about the conference.
It started in 1994. I had been interested in consciousness, and as were several of my colleagues at the University of Arizona. And, the topic of consciousness had been kind of banned from science during the first part of the 20th century by behaviorist psychology. They wanted to measure stuff, and they wanted to put psychology into science, and you can't measure consciousness, so it became somewhat taboo. But in the 80s, there were some prominent people who wrote books about consciousness. Gerald Edelman, Nobel Prize winner, Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner, and Roger Penrose, subsequent Nobel Prize winner, wrote books that brought it into the public eye. And I thought the time was right for an interdisciplinary conference, bringing all different approaches together. So I went to my friends, and they agreed, and we organized the first conference in 1994 at the medical school in Tucson. We packed the auditorium of 350 people. There were no email had just come out. It was mostly by faxes, and it was quite an event. And we had one day for each discipline, which was probably not a smart thing to do. But I wasn't going to do another one. I thought, well, that was great. Hopefully somebody else would. But they couldn't agree on an interdisciplinary approach. So I said, okay, we'll organize it again in 2 years because every year is too much work. But somebody, a psychologist from Italy, Chloe Tede Ferretti, wanted to organize one with our name and co-sponsorship. So we agreed, and we did the 1995 conference in Italy on the island of Ischia near Capri. And then in 96 went back to Tucson, 97 to Denmark, 98 back in Tucson, and 99 Japan, and so forth. And it's just gone on every other year in Tucson. During the pandemic, it was online. This year, it's going to be hybrid, half it can be online or in person. We have about 400 people coming in person, and I don't know how many online, but it'll be a good-sized conference. So that's almost, we get 600-700 people. We have gotten that many. And it's at a beautiful eco-resort in the mountains outside of Tucson and Los Ventana Canyon Resort. And we have a lot of parties and a lot of social events, a lot of mixing and informal stuff going on. And it's really a lot of fun. People keep coming back, so I keep doing it, getting people to help me.
Come for the party, stay for the science.
Yeah.
Do you think that, is this only for professionals, scientists, researchers? Do you think?
Not at all. A lot of personal introspectionists or seekers, whatever you want to call them, or they call themselves. People are just interested in the topic, no matter what their background, because they read or they follow it, and everybody has it. Not everybody, but people who come have a great interest. So it brings together all kinds of people. And when we first set it up, we had philosophy the first day, neuroscience, then psychology, cognitive science. Then fourth day was math, physics, and biology. And the fifth day was experiential approaches. And we subsequently figured out that that's not a good idea. You shouldn't segregate it because that just builds barriers. You want to integrate and have particular sessions on a particular topic that will have a neuroscientist and a philosopher and somebody experientialist all talking about the same topic. So that's what we've evolved to over the years. But initially, that's how it was more separate. And we've developed a taxonomy and all these topics and how they interact over the years. So people who come every year are quite up on the latest stuff. And there's been a lot happening in recent years, actually. It's accelerated quite a bit.
Let's talk about the anesthesia experience. When I was a boy, I had my appendix out, and I'm sure medicine has changed enormously since this probably would have been the early 60s. And I remember being told in the OR to count backward from 100, and I got to about 94, and that was it. But I have recollection of that. A decade ago, when I had heart surgery, my memory ends with me being wheeled down the hall. I never even got to the OR. I mean, I obviously did, and at some point, the anesthesia was administered, but also there was a forgetting of the time that preceded the administration of the anesthesia that was wiped out. Can you comment on that? What was going on? Is that just me, or is that part of
that retrograde amnesia was probably from a drug like Versed, which is a Valium-like drug, a benzodiazepine, which causes amnesia. And it's from the time you give it, but there does seem to be some kind of backward erasure of awareness going back. So that's probably the Versed. And when you were a kid, you may not have had an IV, and you may not have gotten anything until maybe you breathed the mask. And when I was a kid and I had my tonsils out, I had ether, and I still to this day remember the vivid visual dreaming or hallucination or whatever of going under ether anesthesia. People say the same thing. It's kind of this gentle whirlpool and very kind of psychedelic, and that's because you don't get anything beforehand, so you wouldn't get any Versed because you didn't have an IV. And now that I'm an anesthesiologist, I know what happens is you breathe for kids. You don't want to stick them and poke them for IV, so you breathe them down, and then you get the IV, and then you give them whatever other drugs you need, muscle relaxants and painkillers and whatnot. But you don't have an IV, so with a kid, you're often breathing them down. You have to.
And then there's this relatively new anesthesia, propofol, which I had some eye surgery and was aware throughout the surgery, which was absolutely fascinating to be aware in this. I felt my consciousness was very crisp and alert, didn't feel foggy or dreamy. But of course, here he is, operating inside my eyeball and no feeling or sensation. And yet awareness is, I was conscious through the whole thing. I inquired about buying a gallon or two afterward, actually.
No take home.
No.
Actually, so probably they numbed up your eye with a block, topical, either on the surface or a block behind the eye. Maybe while they gave you propofol, they jabbed you behind the eye. So your eye was numb, and then they gave you the propofol is dose dependent. If you give enough of it, it puts you out entirely. But there's a big sweet spot where you can be in a twilight zone where you're mildly euphoric and crisply conscious and feel wonderful, and are quite happy to lay there while they work on your eye, which is numb anyway. So that's called a sedation with propofol. But if you give more, you're out entirely, and if you give more, you stop breathing, and we have to breathe for you and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I remember at one point the anesthesiologist, at least I presume that's who it was, grabbed my big toe just to see if I would respond verbally. And indeed, I'm here, What a fascinating drug. So new anesthetics are being discovered all the time, I presume.
Not so much. The ones we have, the gases in particular, work quite well. I don't know if any new ones are coming out because they're enormously expensive to develop and test and whatnot. And the two that we have now, that we mainly use sevoflurane and dustflurane, were both developed about 25 years ago. And my chairman actually is the one who introduced, at the University of Arizona, Bernal Brown introduced sevoflurane to clinical practice in the United States. So I don't know if there are any new gases coming out, but there's new propofol derivatives. Ketamine is making a big comeback. We've always used ketamine in certain situations, and now it's being used therapeutically in psychiatry, for example. And I should also say that one of the big topics at the conference is the use of psychedelics therapeutically for depression, for various things. One of our keynote speakers at the conference, Robin Carhart-Harris, is the new director of psychedelic research at UCSF. And he's been to our conference numerous times and has given some really amazing talks about his work on figuring out the mechanism of action of what the psychedelics actually do. So they're kind of the opposite of anesthesia. If you find it, we're looking for a model system that is dampened by anesthesia and increased by psychedelics, the lowest common denominator. That might be the closest we get to figuring out consciousness.
I read an article not long ago that this idea of microdosing with psychedelics as therapy may be more placebo-ic. Can I use the word as an adjective? Is there?
I know what you mean. I don't know if it's proper.
That the effect may be more about expectation than the actual microdose itself. Do you have an opinion on that?
No, I don't. But I do have an opinion on how I know those particular studies. I don't know the data, but I do have an opinion on psychedelics because, as I said, anesthesia and psychedelics are the keys to figuring out consciousness. Find the system or a system or the system stamped by anesthetics and enhanced by psychedelics. We're getting close to the origin of consciousness, which I think. See, most people assume that these drugs, the anesthetics and or the psychedelics, bind to membrane receptors in the membrane on the surface of the cell. But these drugs also go inside the cell, into the neuron, and bind to the microtubules. And we're finding more and more evidence that anesthetics actually act by dampening quantum vibrations in microtubules. Now, most of the work in the literature will say that they act on membrane receptors, GABA receptors, and whatnot. But they may well bind there, but that doesn't mean that's where they act. And similarly, I think the psychedelics may get into the cell and increase the quantum vibrations in the microtubules, which would cause the psychedelic state. So we're going to try to test that hypothesis pretty soon, I hope.
So about the research in psychedelics, street drugs are so bad that different from the 60s when LSD was actually coming from Sandoz, and the government they didn't know the difference between micrograms and milligrams, apparently, and they ordered way too much and started giving it away to university researchers and even the military. And I think that accounts for the availability of really laboratory quality LSD in the 60s. Today, that's not available on the street. Lord knows what's in street drugs anymore. But for the purposes of this research, is there laboratory quality, good quality LSD and psilocybin and mescaline and these other drugs that we think of as recreational available to legitimate researchers?
Yeah, we don't do that kind of work at Arizona, but my friend George Mashore, the other anesthesia guy at the University of Michigan, they have a lab and do that. Robin Carhart-Harris at UCSF. Johns Hopkins has done some great work in that. So these centers tend to work with the government and get that kind of supply. But on the other hand, there's a lot of studies, including at the University of Arizona, on psilocybin for depression, for example, and post-traumatic stress syndrome, that sort of thing. So that must be more available. But One interesting study that Carhart Harris presented at our conference in 2012, this is, he took volunteers, put them in an MRI scanner with an IV and gave them intravenous psilocin. So the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, while they were in an MRI scanner with their eyes closed and not talking. And they reported later what their experience was. And they indeed were having a psychedelic trip, a lot of times hallucinations with their eyes closed while their brains were being scanned and with fMRI. And the researchers and everybody expected their brains to light up like a pinball machine when they were having all these vivid hallucinations, but were shocked to see that the fMRI was cold and dark, as if the brain was hypoactive. It was not active at all. It was metabolically inert. It was like even less so than sleeping. And this finding is still being debated in the consciousness world, because what I would say is happening is that under those circumstances, without interacting, so the subject's not even having to talk, just laying there with their eyes closed, consciousness has gone to a deeper quantum level, which doesn't require cognition. You're not driving a car. You're not doing anything that requires your membranes to be active. But consciousness is more pure at a deeper state in the microtubule quantum states themselves. And then from there, according to Penrose, it goes to the structure of the universe. So your membranes are for cognition, are for interacting with the outside world. And if you don't have to interact, if you're just laying there appreciating the effects of psilocybin, having a wonderful time, your membranes can be on snoozing. So that other people have different interpretation of that, but it's the kind of thing that keeps people fascinated by this field, because that was an unexpected finding.
An MRI and a psychedelic, as if the MRI alone is not frightening enough.
Right.
Well, just as an anesthesia seems to shut down awareness, the psychedelic seems to open it. What about the idea that perhaps the brain filters awareness or focuses awareness, and the psychedelic sort of opens that filter, so to speak, such that there's an increased flow of awareness coming into you? At least it feels that way. How would you relate to that?
Yeah, coming into you and coming out of you, because it's a two-way street. And I think I think the problem in understanding the brain is to think of it as a computer and as consciousness as a computation. I don't think that's right, and that approach stems from the idea of each neuron firing or not firing being a fundamental bit or unit. And yet, as you pointed out, the paramecium, the slime mold are one cells, so they should be, in principle, be one bit or one unit. And yet they're doing all this incredibly complex and interesting cognitive stuff. So you have to look inside, as we've been talking to the microtubules. And if you look at the quantum vibrations in the microtubules, you see that they have quantum resonances every 3 orders of magnitude, going all the way down into terahertz in the range of visible light. So terahertz is, bear with me for a second here, 10 to the 12th hertz, and then gigahertz is like microwaves, 10 to the 9th, megahertz like FM radio, like we're on right now, in a million hertz, and kilohertz, 1,000 hertz, and then hertz, you're in EEG range. So most people looking at the brain go down in scale to get to individual neurons and EEG, maybe 100 hertz, a couple hundred hertz. But it turns out that inside neurons, there are all these faster vibrations that are also self-similar. They repeat every 3 orders of magnitude, going all the way down into the visible. So it's kind of like an orchestra more than a computer, where you have high-frequency instruments resonating and interfering with lower frequencies and bass and that sort of thing. So I think the brain is more like a quantum orchestra than a computer. Except that you don't need a conductor. It's a self-organizing resonance and interference system, which gives you beats and resonances and harmonies over many, many scales, 15 orders of magnitude within the brain. And then, according to Penrose, another 30 orders of magnitude down to the fine-scale structure of the universe, because one of the upshots of his theory is that our brain function through quantum computations of microtubules is connected to the fine-scale structure of the universe, and somehow we're all connected in space and time.
Well, that's a fascinating way of looking at it. There is this string theory about the universe. I mean, energy is a vibration. It has amplitude and frequency, and you've just described the spectrum from brain waves, which is like, 1 to 40 hertz, up through these radio waves. You say to visible light, there are frequencies being produced in the brain at that high level?
Strange as it seems, yes. Now, this has been known for a long time, but it was thought to be kind of a byproduct photons from chemical reactions. But there's more and more evidence that there's organized quantum optical effects going on in the microtubules and in other structures, including membranes. And this phenomenon called superradiance, for example, and subradiance, which is a quantum effect. And it's looking like these quantum optical effects may be organized and necessary for consciousness. And in fact, some of the experiments that we're doing through the Templeton research program seems to be showing that the quantum effects in microtubules that are inhibited by anesthesia. So we find them and then we add an anesthetic and it goes away. And we also want to look at psychedelics and see if it goes the other way and increases the vibrations. But yeah, that's what it's looking like, photons in the brain. And this, going back thousands of years of light as a metaphor for consciousness, halos and auras and all that, there may be something to that. So we'll see where that goes in the next couple of years.
That's really a beautiful concept in a world that is so obsessed with physical and the appearance of things, to consider that there's a song behind it all, a melody, a harmony, a rhythm. It's all sound and light. Yeah.
Multidimensional spatio-temporal hierarchy and rhythm. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's really beautiful. We could go hours, but then again, we really can't. How can people find out more about your conference, and if not attend in person?
You can attend in person or online. The website, www.consciousness.arizona.edu. And that's our Center for Consciousness Studies website. If you go there, you'll see the conference lineup. It's an amazing lineup. We have 4 keynote speakers, Christoph Koch on the Brain and Consciousness Day, and then Robin Carhart Harris, whom I mentioned, on psychedelics. That whole day is on psychedelics. Then we have Avi Loeb talking about extraterrestrial consciousness, and a talk by my friend Dante Loretta on his project to bring back organic molecules from an asteroid to look for life and consciousness. And then the last day keynote is David Chalmers, who's very famous now, and on his new book, Reality Plus, on whether our existence is a simulation, which I don't think so, but and Dave thinks it may be 25%, but it's a fascinating area. And then the final session will be on quantum neuroscience, organized by my friend Hartmut Nevin at Google. And Google is now they've gotten into quantum computing and are now getting very interested in quantum biology. And we had a conference there a few months ago. So, and then there's social events and talk by an ayahuasca shaman and a debate between Sue Blackmore and Deepak Chopra and a bunch of other very interesting stuff, including poetry slam and zombie blues performance.
That's just too cool. I want to thank you on behalf of more people than either of us know, just for bringing to academia this field. When I was in school, the idea of studying consciousness, if I had gone to, the course catalog or the dean or whomever, they would not have had any idea what I was even talking about. And now schools like University of Arizona, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, I think UCLA has a consciousness studies department or a mindfulness center, don't they?
I'm not sure, but I want to thank our sponsor, Eugene Jong, who is funding our educational program at the University of Arizona.
Well, certainly you've been at the forefront, and you're largely responsible for that. And I just think it's fascinating work, and I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I understand you hope in the near future to have degree programs available for students who want to major in consciousness studies, right?
Yes. Our first goal would be an undergraduate minor. This is being organized by the Center for Conscious Studies co-director Tom Bever, who set up these courses. I'm going to be giving a course from next year. So far, I've given some classes in Tom's course, and we hope to develop it into an undergraduate and graduate program. I get so many emails and letters from people who want to come study and just don't have the time. I mean, I've been working in the operating room most of my almost full time, and I'm retiring from that. So hope to spend a couple of years just directing the Center for Consciousness Studies and doing more research and trying to get to the bottom of all this.
Wonderful. Would you give that website one more time?
www.consciousness.arizona.edu. Consciousness is hard to spell. CONSCIOUSESS.
Dr. Stuart Hameroff from University of Arizona in beautiful Tucson. And Dr. Stuart, thank you so much for being with us today. I know you're a busy fellow, and I really, really appreciate it. Let's stay in touch. I would.
Yeah, you should come to the conference.
I plan to do my best. If I can't actually be there, which I'd prefer, I'll be online.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Mike. Great questions. Appreciate
it. Thanks again. Let's stay in touch, and maybe down the calendar we can do another one of these programs.
Sounds great. Thank you.
You're listening to the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School on KPFK in Los Angeles. I want to thank my producer, Mark Brisky. Suggest you stay tuned for Gary Harrison, and you'll find this program streaming at its homepage, theagelesswisdom.com. The THE is part of it, theagelesswisdom.com. And we're also podcast as the Ageless Wisdom Mystery School and have our own YouTube channel as well. Thanks for listening. Join us next week. As always, be gentle, love life, and take care of each other. From Los Angeles, this is Michael Benner.